Hi folks. If you've also had learning to code on your bucket list for the last year or two like I've had, and I've just basically got nowhere with it, I just haven't had time to start yet. And I just realized New Year is coming up, and you know what, why wait until New Year? I might as well try and do it now. Time between Christmas and New Year is usually quite quiet. So I decided to get down to it and get started. And the big thing with learning to code is you really need to either have some other itch to scratch. In other words, something that you really need to have developed that'll make life easier for you. Or, like I've done in the past, I coded last probably 21 plus years ago. I used to have a particular application, and then every time I learned a new language, I would apply my knowledge and update that same program in the new language, applying the new techniques and that sort of thing. Because that's the best way to actually learn. You've got to have something to apply the issue to. You can't just go through the tutorials and think, okay, now I can code. You really want to actually do something. So I developed this little app over here you can see on the screen. And the reason why really was I had been playing around with this Cloudflare WARP thing. And I noticed on Linux there's 0 GUI apps. Well, there's one, but it just says connect and disconnect, and that's all it did. And I thought, you know what, that might just be a useful little project to write something to do something actually that does something. So you can see here, this is the problem I sat with really. If you have installed it and you type in it's all CLI based basically. So if you type in warp-CLI help, you'll see these are all the various commands that you have to remember if you want to do something. Like if you want to set family mode, if you want to connect, if you want to see the settings, if you want to check the stats or the status over here and so on. So you can see an example of the output. You type in warp CLI status and you'd get some information saying it's connected. If you type in warp stats, you'll see endpoints, time, sent, estimated latency, loss, that sort of thing. And if you want to adjust the family mode, which basically sets sort of certain filtering to filter malware or pornography or whatever the case is, you can have it full family mode, you can have it off, or you can have it set to malware. But the point is that you must type this in every time. So if you want to make odd little quick changes or check something, then as I said, you've got to really go to the command line to do it. So I thought, well, you know what, why not really? It might be quite handy then to write something like this. And yeah, to do it, I'll give a little bit of an overview of the code actually after I've just shown you the app, because I think it gives more context, just understanding what the app does and what it looks like than maybe when I actually just give the overview of the code. I'd really just sort of looked at the essential information I wanted to change or look at this stage. It's very easy to now just iteratively add more and more and more functionality to this. I haven't finished obviously the design and the layout stuff. There's a couple of to-dos I must still do here, but this is essentially just its root window that you're seeing here at the moment with a title and an icon. And I've got 4 frames with 2 buttons. So one of the frames over here is called status, and in it I've got a button showing whether it's connected, or if it's not, it'll be red and saying disconnected. At this stage I must still put an activate for this button so that the button will also actually change the status. Then I've got just a settings display over here. This just reads that settings command and displays certain of the essential information that I wanted to see on here, some of it of which we can change, and then it'll refresh and update it. And then I've also got a little stats frame. Again, it's just pulling through certain things from the statistics. And I've got a family mode frame. And what happens over here is if you click to change the family mode, you'll notice if you watch over here by Cloudflare for Families, this will change and refresh as it sends the command to the command line. So if I go to full, you'll see it changes over there to full. If you go to off, it changes to off. And if you change back to malware, it goes back to malware. Yes, I must fix the refresh on these frames as well. What these commands really are doing here, as well as the connection status, is it's passing a command line instruction to the operating system. And for these settings and stats and so on, it's reading it back. It's from that command line action that you're executing. So if I click this, then it's actually sending the instruction through to the operating system, and settings will actually also have issued a command, but it reads back these results and they should be updated if this is executed correctly. And that's really mostly what this is doing. The refresh is just refreshing the button status, the settings, and the stats. So if I click there, you can see it. If you watch over here, you'll see some of this information is actually refreshing as I click it. I must still decide whether I want to have it auto updating, but obviously that's going to have a little bit of an overhead on the traffic. So let's go and have a look at the code, I think, and it'll just give an overview of what I did. What I can also just say about the code, before we go and look at the code, I can just say I've essentially, to get to where I was with this, I really made use of two resources to learn my Python. I looked at the python.land website, which has got a massive tutorials with lots of examples, and that was really just to get up to scratch and speed with the variable types and the syntax and that sort of thing. You know, how does a list operate, how do the if else loops work, that sort of thing. And then the other big resource that I used was about a 5.5 hour tutorial video by Free Code Camp, and that was on Tkinter. Tkinter is a graphics handling library, and that essentially is handling all this Windows stuff, the frame stuff, the buttons, that sort of thing. And that's all really that I was actually using. So that video, I took about 2 days to go through it, doing all the examples and that sort of thing. And I found that then fairly easy to apply to this actually. So the actual coding work took me about half to 3/4 of a day, and most of that was just struggling with syntaxes and trying to parse certain of the strings. You get this sort of string back from the operating system over here in lines, and you've got to parse it into separate list items and then read them and display them over here. So that was really what took me the most time, is just sorting that sort of format out. I'll put links below the video as well to those resources that I made use of. And then I think let's go and have a look at the code. I'll keep it on the screen maybe just for reference there. So I want to publish this still obviously as open source. I haven't yet decided exactly which license I'm going to actually use finally and where I'm going to publish it. But the idea will be it's open source for reshare, and it stays open source. So it's not going to be, I'm not going to allow anybody to take the code and use it for commercial purposes and not reshare the code. So the essential parts of the program, it is about 190 lines. I'll just go over the brief areas to give you an overview. I'm not going to go and explain each and every command in detail or anything. You basically start off your Python program with declaring which libraries need to be imported for use. So typically, for example, that tkinter I talked about, you need to import that and the message box functionality for these things to work, and that these commands will be recognized in the code. The image part was really just for the icon. That's all I'm using it for. And the other two important ones were sys and subprocess. Those allow you to interact with the command line interface and the operating system to check a few things. Then the next step is really just setting the root window, and that is the base window that you see here. I've named it root, I've given it a title, I've given it an icon, and I've defined a size for it as well there. Then the next essential part here is I've done 3 checks, and I'm going to exit the application if these don't pass. I will pop up a message, an error message, but essentially I've written it for Linux only, so it checks to see that it's running on Linux. If not, it'll give an error and it'll exit. The reason mainly is there is stuff already for Windows and Mac and that sort of thing. So I could do it for the others as well. It's not actually that difficult, but you'd have to adapt the code. Remember, I'm writing to the command line interface, so I would have to adapt, maybe make some adaptations to the code. But for now, I'm just doing it as Linux. Then I'm checking for Python 3. If it's less than Python 3, then it's also giving a message and exiting over here. I'm also checking to make sure that the warp-svc service is actually running on the operating system. If not, I'm actually popping up a message how to do it, and I'm exiting. The reason is I don't want to execute root commands and things from the application. I'm just keeping everything user level. And apart from that, if it passes those tests, it's ready to go. These are the frames that I've defined. So there was a connection status, a settings, a stats, and a family mode toggle. And they basically just been given a label, which is that description, and a grid size and where they're going to be located in this root window. That's these rows and columns. And then I've defined a couple of functions just to handle various things. So one of the functions is, for example, if these radio buttons in here called I've just called them family. So if family has been clicked, then it will call this function and pass the value of whichever the button is it's been pressed. And you can see then I am execute. This is one of the examples here of when I'm executing a process to the command line. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm running the main command. Because it's family mode, I'm already passing that parameter through. And the next parameter being passed will be the value that is returned here. So essentially what will be coming back is the word full, malware, or off. So that will be executing warp CLI, set families mode, off, or full, or whatever the case is. Then the next function is refresh this settings frame over here. And what this is really doing is same thing again. It's running that command, the warp CLI settings, but it's capturing the output, and it is also performing a split lines function. And what the split lines does is it's reading each line that comes back as the result that's been captured, and it essentially imports it into a Python list. And the way of addressing a Python list is with these array numbers here. So if I said, for example, it's all coming back into warp settings, so it'll create one big list called warp settings. If I say warp settings 0, that will read just the first line. Warp settings 1 will be the second line, the third line, the fourth line, the fifth line, and so on. And I've basically set those to some variables here. And the next part of this command really is now that it's captured and read it back from the command, it's creating a label, and it is then displaying it at this location with inside the frame over there. So you can obviously change the sort order and things here if you wanted to. So that will basically display those, and it's convenient because it's already got the description in the command line return. So I didn't really have to do any other labels or anything else with it there. Then I've got the refresh stats frame. It's basically a similar thing. The only difference here really is it's for this little frame. Is I'm executing it with the warp stats command, same type of capture, split lines again, and I'm taking the various lines that I'm actually interested in displaying. You'll notice I've left out 0 because I didn't want to use that first parameter that came back, and then again labeling and displaying it inside that frame. Then the other function that I'm making use of here is the update connectivity status, which is this one over here. And you'll see here again, I'm running a command to check that status, obviously, capturing it, and I'm only using the one line, the second line over there. And what I'm asking here, or what I'm checking here, is to see if what's returned over there in that line, is it exactly equal to this string over there? If it is, then I'm going to make the button green and it'll be called connected. If not, it will be red and it'll say disconnected. So this is a little bit problematic at the moment. It's not always returning the string very accurately. I might have to work on that still at the moment. And then of course I've just placed the button there inside the frame. The only other function left really was a function called refresh all, which is obviously used by this button as well. If you press that button, or I need a refresh all, it'll essentially just execute these three functions that I've already defined up here, the updating and the refreshing of the status and the stats. Then the main program itself just starts here, and it starts by calling, I'm actually just realizing now I could reduce this to just recall refresh all actually, but it basically draws these over here by executing and extracting information, and then it draws the radio buttons over here, which you see on the screen. So I've just given it a default to malware. I want to change this to still reading that result higher up and showing the one that it already is actually. So that's going to be changed still. That's the placing and the defining of each of the radio buttons. And you'll see there, if it's clicked, it's going to execute that family clicked function that I described a bit higher up. And the last two things then really are the button, the refresh button and the quit button that I've put on the screen there. And what they're going to do, this one will execute refresh all function. This one will essentially quit the root window. And the root.main loop is just required so that the tkinter window is constantly looping and checking for things like button presses and changes and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's really it. I can actually just show maybe one or two changes. You can just see what happens here. For example, let me just exit this just to show that this stuff does actually work. If I was to change, for example, to say, okay, at the moment I'm checking for Python greater than version 3, but if I just reverse that quickly, you can see what would happen if you'd started this with Python less than version 3. So I've reversed this now, and you can see what happens if I start this with Python. If you had, for example, Python 2 or something. Oh, the other window has just appeared off screen, unfortunately, but essentially it throws up that. This requires Python 3 or above. So let me just put that back. And the one for the services running here, for example, it's a similar type of thing. If I said I've got it there as not equal to, so I said if I change that to say equals, now you run it. Again, you won't see anything in the window, but the message that would have popped up will say there, started with systemctl start warp-svc. I must maybe just expand that a little bit to say, because I think it's a sudo, and it's from the CLI, I should just say maybe as well. And it exits. Just get that back. The other thing I can show is with the connection as well. And this is just going to show now what happens if we disconnect from the service. What happens to the stats here? Now I just had to go and make a little bit of a fix to the code, which I'll show you, because what happened was it was drawing those stats and passing through the text to show this display over here. Now the problem is if it's disconnected, the stats is not showing anything. So that returns an error because there's nothing coming back. There's no array created, and it can't get to item 2, 3, 4, 5, and it gives an error. So I had to put a little if statement in to say, you know, if it's connected, do this, else just display a message. Otherwise, like I said, it crashes. So let me just show you quickly what it does here. If I disconnect, oh, let me just show you quickly. I am connected there. You can see I've refreshed. If I disconnect, you'll see now if I say refresh, it's showing here that the status is disconnected, and it's changed this here to say not connected. Obviously, I must also sort of clean up, you know, how this is resizing and so on. I'll have to figure out how to do that still. But let me just connect again. Connected, and if I refresh now, the stats will be back and it'll show a green connected button over there. I've also just tidied this up. I've done the same thing here to clear this frame. Now I don't have this overwriting anymore. You'll see if I say full, it changes it nice and clean to full, but it's also resizing slightly. Obviously off is okay, and malware back on, it readjusts again. So, you know, that's something I must just figure out. But let me show you then the code update quickly. So the clearing of the frame was this part. If I'm refreshing stats, if I call this function, I'm going to say there, I'm just iterating through the widgets and I'm destroying them. And then I've just added this if statement now to say if connected, and I've created a global variable, and where I'm doing this button thing where I've set it green or red, I've also just said make it connected to true or make it connected to false. So I've said if connected as before, but if not connected, the else statement now will just display that message. Remember, it's already clearing it at the beginning. So I've put it at the beginning of this function, which will always clear the full stats, which is quite nice. So even if there's any overwriting or changes here now, you're not going to see any overwrites there either. So that's really just how you iterate through correcting and fixing, I suppose, you know, the little bits and pieces. As you add more, you'll find little things break, but that's the joy and excitement of coding. So that's really pretty well much it for the moment. It's definitely got a couple of more things I just need to fix and troubleshoot and so on. But hopefully it inspires some others to also start programming. And certainly Python I've been very, very impressed with. You know, it was quite easy to actually do the whole windowing thing and everything. And I mean, I might consider even doing this maybe for some of the other VPN services like ExpressVPN or Proton VPN, because in many cases they lack a good sort of GUI interface for, especially for Linux, that is. So yeah, maybe it's something I'd probably like to do. That's, I think, the exciting thing and the inspiring thing about programming is that you are able to develop and create something that just fulfills a need. And if it's not just for you, it's also maybe just for a couple of other people as well. And of course, apart from that, the other important thing is by publishing the source code, others can then also learn and see how to solve a particular issue or check a syntax or something like that. So, we all assist each other and it sort of grows from there. So I hope some of you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in my next video.